Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. Today, as we learned last time from the New Deal, World War II would be our next chapter of study. However, in your book, we kind of focus on, like American the social aspect, the economy, society, and all that. So now we're going to talk what leads America to get involved in World War II prior to that. So basically from like following World War I up until we get involved. So yeah, it's a little segue building up to the drama that is World War II. So we're almost nearing the end of period 7. It's been a lot of chapters, that's for sure. But here, this is what we're talking about. The Global Crisis, chapter 25. 7 more chapters and we're done. Or is it 8? Nah, we're almost there. And the test is coming soon. All right. 1921, 1941. So it's good to start at a starting point. Begin. It's good to begin at a starting point. Use different words, Mr. WWII. So we have the Washington Conference of 1921, where several nations agreed to reduce their militaries. You have the 5-Power Pact. Now remember, this, because of the Treaty of Versailles and the 14 points, the U.S. was never in the United Nations. So we had to have our own agreements before we could, do anything internationally. So we created the 5-Power Pact between U.S., Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. So it's kind of like a ratio. So the U.S. would get to have 5 tons of ships built. Japan would get 3, and then 1.75 for France and Italy. And then you also have something called the 9-Power Pact, where the U.S. and 8 other countries agreed to continue open door policy in China. So, fun stuff. Okay, you have the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was an agreement that outlawed war. And a lot of countries signed this because they saw how destructive World War I was. However, much like the League of Nations, there was no real enforcement mechanism in place. So good luck trying to stop that from happening. Again, the Dawes Plan, where this was shortly when Germany said that they couldn't make any more reparations, or the Weimar Republic couldn't make any more reparations. So the U.S., seeing that they need a stronger Germany in Central Europe, the U.S. banks loaned money to Germany, who then paid Britain and France those reparation payments, and then Britain and France would take some of those monies and send it back to the U.S. Treasury. And it was a circle of money, and as we stated last time, it ends with the stock market crash in 1929. President Hoover was president. He sucked. The only thing he is recognizable internationally, he didn't enforce the Roosevelt Corollary, so he wasn't a big expansionist. He wasn't willing to use the U.S.'s military to intervene in Latin America. And Latin America probably enjoyed some autonomy during this time period. You have the overseas expansion in Europe, as we learned last year, Lebensraum, where Germany is seeking more living space for their growing population. And Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. And what comes out of that is the Stimson Doctrine, where the U.S. will refuse to recognize Japanese gains. So even though they invaded Manchuria and technically part of the Japanese Empire, the US would not recognize that as being part of Japan. Manchuria, if you recall, is northeast China. So here you have Herbert Hoover and his dog. Probably wants to run away because he was a bad president. I say he was a bad president. He got the raw end of the deal. And then this is, I think, Henry Stimson. All right, isolationism and internationalism. So you have the World Economic Conference in London, 1933. FDR goes, and FDR stated he disliked the gold standard, meaning our economy, our money is backed with the amount of gold there is in the world. FDR didn't like it, and that shocked a bunch of people there. You also have this thing called the reciprocal trade agreement, where the U.S. would lower tariffs on foreign countries that would lower their tariffs and do the same. Remember, Hoover was a Republican, and Republicans wanted to raise tariffs, whereas FDR is a Democrat, and Democrats want to bring the tariff rates down. Think of that. Down tariff rates, Democrat. Raise tariff rates, Republican. Okay, you have the U.S. recognition of the Soviet Union in 1933. The U.S. recognizes Stalin's government. They hoped that Stalin and the USSR would help contain Japan's growing power because, as we know, Russia, or the Soviet Union extends from Europe all the way across the Asian continent, and they kind of do border. I mean, Japan is an archipelago of islands, a group of islands, so being friendly with the Soviet Union would prevent Japan to expand. The USSR would promise to stop propaganda in the United States during this time. They had a very good propaganda inside scoop in our country. Sound familiar? And then you have the good neighbor policy created by FDR, who wanted to improve relations with Latin America and have actual cordial relations, and less of a military aspect, using military force to intervene. They would want to do it more diplomatically, more like a gentleman. So here you have FDR with one of the Latin American leaders. So, sorry, this is important. This shows America's isolation and change to intervention. So you have this NEI committee where there was a Senate committee that alleged the U.S. became involved in World War I, so businesses could profit. It was believed as truth by many at the time, not so much today. 1935, Benito Mussolini invades Ethiopia, and there was a large fear spreading across Europe that another world war would be close. And, at the time, the Great War, as it was referenced, was the most destruction, catastrophic death toll that the world had seen up until that point. All right. So until the next one. But, people didn't want to fight again. It had only been, 1935? The war ends in 1918. 17 years later, they don't want to fight. So the U.S. will pass neutrality acts at home in 1935, 1936, and 1937, and they're basically the same, just getting more specific year in, year out. So basically, the U.S. could not sell weapons to warring or belligerent, as it's called, belligerent countries. Know that term, belligerent. Doesn't mean drunk, all right? Doesn't mean incoherent. It's just warring countries, belligerent countries. Put that in your memory banks. Okay, it did not matter who the aggressor or who was the victim. So in this case, even though Ethiopia was invaded and taken over, Haile Selassie goes to the League of Nations and say, I need help. And all the League of Nations does is sanction Italy, if you remember that from last year. So since Ethiopia was taken over by Italy, the U.S. could not sell weapons to Ethiopia because they're technically at war. Doesn't matter who the victim was. And then non-military goods could be sold via cash and carry policy, meaning countries that needed non-military goods like foodstuffs and all the other types that is not non-military aid. This cash and carry policy, you would have to pay up front in total, and you would have to come to the United States and get it. Cash and carry. The U.S. could not provide loans to belligerent nations, and U.S. citizens, learning from the Lusitania mishap, U.S. citizens could not travel on ships from warring nations. And then you have FDR's quarantine speech. Quarantine means something different nowadays. Oh, man. Anyways, FDR's speech was in response to Japanese aggression out in the Pacific, and they're going to encourage economic sanctions on Japan. And that's not Bill Nye. His name is Nye. His last name is Nye. That was him. Okay, the Munich conference we learned about last year, and this was in response to Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia, which was in clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, Hitler, they didn't want that to happen. So many countries were fearful still of another war. So what was decided is they would follow that policy of appeasement. Remember, giving in to keep the peace, right? So giving in to the demands of an aggressor, in this case, it's Hitler. So France and Britain both allow Hitler to have parts of Czechoslovakia where I believe Hitler said there are about 3 million Germans living in this area. So he wanted them in his German sphere. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, after the end of the agreement where Hitler was agreeing that he would never take any more parts, he wouldn't annex any more lands into his German realm. And he shows up and he's like, I got this agreement right here, peace in our time. This will provide peace in our time. Boy, was he wrongo. Hitler will violate the agreement within 6 months. So here's that picture. Neville Chamberlain saying, peace in our time, boys, peace in our time. All right, big things happen. Again, this is still before the U.S. is even involved in the war. All right, World War I has kind of started, 1939, and the U.S. passes the Neutrality Act of 1939 in response to Germany's invasion of Poland, and it was designed to help France and Britain. So now the U.S. kind of switched up their neutrality acts from 1935 to 1937 for 1939. So now the U.S. could sell weapons to democracies. It doesn't have to be a warring nation. Now it could be a democracy via the cash and carry. So they still have to pay in full before they could come pick it up. And if you recall, Germany has a great navy of untersea boats, U-boats. If you guys remember that. Holla. You have two important U.S. groups back at home trying to prevent war or intervene in war. And you have the first, the Committee to Defend America, who were interventionists, and they favored sending aid to those countries. Let's intervene. Let's help them out. Remember, hasn't been that long that the U.S. has been their own country, right? And we have a long history of trade between France and Great Britain. But you have the opposite group, the America First Committee, who are isolationists, and one of them is Mr. Spirit of the St. Louis, Charles Lindbergh, who says, no, we don't need to intervene. Let's keep America first. Make America first. So you have the Arsenal of Democracy speech given by FDR, where he claimed that the U.S. should aid European countries that resist German aggression. And his arsenal refers to the U.S.'s ability to make war materials for allied countries to resist German aggression. You have the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, which drastically increases the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. The U.S. now could loan crucial supplies to countries that the president deems vital to the safety of America, which is, at this time, Great Britain and France. So the U.S. now would, instead of reverting back to the cash and carry policy, the U.S. would transport goods as far as Iceland. And now these warring, our brothers in France and Germany, France and Great Britain no longer have to pay the money up front because they're worried they gotta fight a war. And as we know, wars cost money. So the U.S. would make those goods and say, future payment, bro. Go on and take it. Then you have the shoot on sight policy, which is a drastic change in our type of policy, where it's a reaction that from a conflict between a U.S. boat and a German submarine. And now, if the U.S. Navy saw German submarines, they would shoot on sight. And notice, we aren't even in the war yet. We still aren't even in the war. So if they saw a German U-boat, the U.S. ships would shoot upon seeing them, shoot on sight. Next, you have the Atlantic Charter, August 1941, shortly after the beginning of World War I. Or shortly after. What am I talking about? World War II began in 1939, Mr. Ovalle. Get your dates right. So it was the first wartime meeting between now U.S. President FDR and now elected new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, our boy. So they outlined the goals for a post-World War II world, which included the ideas of self-determination, lower trade barriers, economic cooperation, yada, yada, yada. So that's the boat. That's my boat. And then here's Lindbergh giving a speech with a portrait of George Washington behind him. So from neutrality to intervention, last slide, U.S.-Japanese relations, they weren't good. So you have the Panay incident, 1937, where the Japanese attacked a U.S. ship. Japan apologized, and American isolationists urged the U.S. to, move on, let's forget about it. But the U.S., seeing how Japan is just overly dominating China at this time, word has gotten around about the rape of Nanking. Okay, so the U.S. will freeze Japanese assets that they have in our country, that they invested in our stock market, in other businesses where they can, make trade agreements with. The U.S. freezes that, and they will institute a embargo on Japan with crucial natural resources that are important to Japan's military expansion, their aggressive stance towards war, rubber and oil, and that's what really kind of tips over the balance. So December 7, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese Navy, and shortly thereafter, I think it was December 8th, the U.S. declared war on Japan and Germany immediately following. So this is a picture of the Panay incident. All right, that was the end of this lecture. Fairly short, and fairly quick as well. So, now the next time we meet, we will be talking about World War II, but again, from the American sphere, the American perspective, all right? And this was the American perspective of the events that led to us ultimately getting involved in World War II. So hopefully you guys did enjoy that. Hopefully it was some new information that you never heard about, because that's always good, right? Learning new things. If you did like that, make sure you hit that like button for your boy. And as always, stay safe, wash your hands. Peace.